The wine glass trembled in my hand as Madison, my own daughter, said it. "You're just renting time here." Still, I held my breath, fingers tightening around the stem, controlling the storm inside. As the low hum of conversation filled the air, the scent of the wine, once comforting, grew bitter, each drop like acid. While I stared at her, I realized she had never seen me as her mother, only as a stepping stone. The same realization settled like lead in my chest. That's when I decided Madison would never claim what I built. The wine glass clinked softly on the table. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The Carrington home was quiet, save for the clinking of silverware and the murmur of muted conversation. Ellie had spent hours preparing the meal, her hands deftly chopping vegetables, her mind retreating into the familiar rhythm of her kitchen. It was supposed to be a family dinner, a reunion of sorts, to celebrate what little there was left of the family bond. But in the quiet corners of her mind, Ellie knew something had already started to fracture. The house, tucked away on a tree-lined street in one of Chicago's more affluent neighborhoods, gleamed under the soft glow of evening light. Ellie's eyes lingered on the grand chandelier above the dining table, a piece she had bought with her own money, a testament to the life she had built for herself, alone. Madison and David arrived later than expected, the low hum of their voices floating in from the front door. The sound of laughter followed, but it was forced, awkward in a way that Ellie had come to expect. They had always been late. It was a subtle but telling sign of how their priorities had shifted over the years. Still, Ellie had invited them, her daughter, her only child. "Sorry we're late," Madison called as she entered the dining room, her voice sharp with the tiredness of someone who had spent the day fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Ellie rose from her seat, offering a smile she didn't quite feel. "You're here now," she replied, gesturing for them to sit. David mumbled an apology as he took his seat next to his wife. His eyes swept over the table, admiring the polished silverware and the wine glasses gleaming under the chandelier's light. A look of appreciation, or perhaps expectation, lingered on his face. Ellie noticed the way Madison settled into her chair, as though the space itself was an affront to her. Madison had always been like that, as though every room they entered had to bend to her will. The meal began in the typical manner, small talk mixed with the clink of utensils. Lily, sitting at the far end of the table, looked up at Ellie from time to time, a sweet, open gaze that seemed to be the only thing that grounded her in the chaos of it all. Her daughter, despite everything, was still young, still learning what it meant to truly belong to a family like this one. The wine flowed freely, as it always did at these gatherings. Ellie poured another glass for herself, feeling the warmth spread through her as the conversation became looser, more animated. But it was Madison, tipsy from the wine, who broke the fragile spell. Ellie was mid-pour when Madison's voice cut through the air like a knife, casual but heavy with meaning. "You're just renting time here," she said, looking directly at Ellie, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The words hung in the air for a long, suffocating moment. David laughed, but it was a nervous, uncomfortable sound, his way of trying to cover up the sting, to make it seem like nothing. A chuckle, but one that didn't reach his eyes. Lily, still too young to understand the full weight of the remark, frowned slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing that something wasn't right. Ellie's hand trembled just a little as she poured the wine, the glass barely catching the light as it filled. Her mind raced, but she remained still, outwardly calm, like the surface of a pond that hid a storm beneath. Madison's words echoed in her head, the finality of them sinking deep, right where the raw spots of old wounds had never fully healed. Renting time. The phrase lingered like the bitterness of spoiled wine. She tried to keep her face neutral, but the words had landed harder than she could have expected. Renting time. That's all she was, wasn't she? A tenant in a life she'd worked so hard to build, a visitor in her own family's history. A quiet laugh escaped her lips, though she wasn't sure whether it was born of disbelief or something darker. She glanced up from the glass in her hand, meeting Madison's eyes across the table. But there was no trace of apology there, no sign that Madison understood the weight of what she had just thrown into the air. David shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden tension, his eyes darting between the two women, but there was nothing he could say. He never had been able to say much in these moments. Ellie's fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass, the coldness of it grounding her in the present. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from fear but from a sudden, sharp clarity. Madison had always underestimated her, and now, with those words, she had crossed a line. Ellie set the wine bottle down with quiet precision, her gaze not leaving Madison for a second. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, measured, like someone who had already made a decision. "I think I need a moment," she said, standing slowly. The room fell silent. Lily shifted in her chair, looking back and forth between her mother and grandmother. Ellie felt the weight of the little girl's gaze, innocent yet searching, like she could sense that something had just broken. She didn't want to stay at that table a second longer. Not while Madison's words were still alive in the air, stinging, carving something new into the family's fragile history. As Ellie walked away, her footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual. The morning after the dinner, Ellie sat in her favorite armchair by the window, the soft light of early morning spilling across the room, touching everything in its path. She stared out at the quiet street, watching a few joggers pass by, lost in the motion of their own lives. But her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the bitter thread of Madison's words, renting time. The phrase had lodged itself deep within her, like a shard of glass that no amount of time would smooth over. Ellie had always prided herself on being in control of her life, of her choices. She had built everything herself, starting with nothing, and now she was surrounded by the opulence of a life that had been hard won. But last night at that table, Madison had stripped her of it all. Renting time. It was as if her very existence was on borrowed terms. It was an insult that sliced through Ellie's carefully constructed world. And it wasn't the first time Madison had belittled her, but this one was different. A quick glance at the clock, and Ellie stood, her movements deliberate. The familiar weight of her thoughts pulled her toward James Cole's office. There was no use wasting time. The old law office, nestled in the heart of downtown Chicago, had always felt like a sanctuary for Ellie. James had been her lawyer for decades, a friend as much as a professional. He knew her better than anyone, understood the weight of every decision she made. She needed him now more than ever. James rose from his desk when she walked into his office, offering his usual reserved smile. The man was impeccably dressed, his dark hair showing a few flecks of gray, but still sharp, still commanding. He motioned to the chair across from him. "Ellie, I wasn't expecting you this early," he said, his tone calm but with a hint of concern. "You look like you've barely slept." Ellie took a seat, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the armrest. "I didn't." She paused, exhaling slowly, a weight pressing against her chest. "Last night," Madison said something that I can't forget. James's eyes flickered with recognition, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. She said, "You're just renting time here." Ellie's voice was steady, but there was a coldness underneath. The words were still fresh, still stinging in ways she hadn't anticipated. She allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before continuing. "And I realized something, James. I've spent my entire life building a legacy for my family, for Madison, for her future, for them. And all this time, I've been treated like a guest in my own house. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the armrest. Ellie, I know you. I know you've always been about family. But if this is truly what's weighing on you, we need to do something. Ellie's gaze hardened. I'm done being underestimated, James. She let the words hang in the air between them. Madison thinks she can say whatever she likes, but there are consequences. I won't allow her to have any more claim over what I've built. James studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered her words. Finally, he nodded. You know, legally, she has no claim to your estate unless you allow her one, but it's your choice. If you want to change things, if you want to cut her out, you can. Ellie felt a cold resolve wash over her. This was it. The moment she would stop pretending. She wasn't going to be a figurehead in her own family anymore. She was going to take back control. I want Madison out of the will, Ellie said, her voice unwavering. All of it. I want my granddaughter, Lily, to inherit everything instead. James gave a small, knowing nod. Understood. I'll draft the new will. We'll make sure it's airtight. Ellie paused for a moment, her thoughts swirling. But her decision was final. I want her to know. I want her to see exactly what she's lost. Her fingers curled into fists. The anger that had been simmering since that night now rose to the surface. She would make sure Madison understood what those words had cost her. James was quiet for a moment, his hands steepled in front of him. Ellie, he said, you're not just cutting her off financially. This will change everything. The family will see you differently. Madison will see you differently. I don't care, she replied, her voice hard and resolute. I've spent too long being the one who holds things together, being the one who gives. If Madison doesn't respect that, if she doesn't respect me, then she's not part of it anymore. James nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. All right, let's get this done. They spent the next hour discussing the details of the new will, ensuring that every legal nuance was addressed. But Ellie's mind was already somewhere else, in the future, where Madison would have no claim to the wealth she thought was hers. Where Lily would carry on the legacy Ellie had worked so hard to build. As Ellie left the office, the weight of the decision didn't feel like a burden, it felt like freedom. She had drawn the line, and Madison had crossed it. But as she walked out into the crisp morning air, she couldn't help but wonder, would it be enough to silence Madison? The ink had barely dried on the new will, but Ellie already felt the distance growing between her and everything she had once known. It was an odd sensation, like stepping out of the shadows into a space where the air was cooler, cleaner, but somehow heavier. The decision to cut Madison out entirely had been swift, sure, but the weight of it settled into her bones, cold and immovable. James had handled the legal intricacies with precision, making sure there were no loopholes, no room for Madison's inevitable backlash. The trust for Lily was airtight, every clause designed to withstand scrutiny. Madison was not just excluded from the inheritance, she was explicitly removed, with clear instructions that her involvement in the family's affairs would cease, forever. Ellie had never felt more alone in a decision, but she had never felt so empowered either. Sitting in her office the morning after the will was finalized, Ellie stared out the window at the quiet neighborhood. The soft rustle of leaves outside barely registered in her mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling in the quiet aftermath of her actions. Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph on her desk, her late husband, smiling beside her at their wedding. A younger version of Madison at their side, beaming with a smile Ellie had once believed would last forever. How quickly the warmth of those days had faded. Ellie stood and walked to the table by the window, where her phone rested. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through a message from Madison. Mom, I need to talk. It's important. When can we meet? Ellie read the words several times, allowing the bitterness to settle in her stomach. Madison had sent a similar text the night before, shortly after Ellie had left the dinner table in silence. But the woman who had arrogantly dismissed Ellie as renting time didn't deserve an audience now. Not after what she'd said. Ellie's fingers hovered over the keys, but she didn't reply. The silence felt more powerful than any words she could have typed in response. Let Madison wonder. Let her feel the sting of the rejection. Ellie wasn't interested in being the object of Madison's manipulative games anymore. If Madison thought her words didn't have consequences, she was about to learn otherwise. Ellie placed the phone back on the table, her eyes narrowing with a quiet resolve. She had already made the decisions that mattered. Now it was time to let the world feel the ripples. A few days passed, and Ellie kept to herself, allowing the dust to settle. She had no intention of drawing attention to herself, not yet. This moment, this silence, was important. It was her space to breathe and prepare for the inevitable fallout. Her next meeting was with Robert, her accountant. He had been with her since the early days, handling the family's finances with the same careful precision she'd applied to every aspect of her life. As she walked into his office, he stood from his desk and greeted her with a measured nod. Ellie, always a pleasure, Robert said, but there was an edge to his voice that wasn't there before. He knew something was different. The air between them had shifted since their last meeting. He could feel it in the room, the way Ellie carried herself now, like someone who was no longer playing a part. Robert, Ellie replied, sitting down at the table. I need to make sure everything's aligned with the new will. There's no room for error. Madison won't be getting a penny, and I want to make sure the trust for Lily is unassailable. I need this to be as clean as possible. Robert listened carefully, his hands folded on the desk, his sharp eyes never leaving her. We've done this before, Ellie. But, are you sure about this? The family? They'll know. Madison? She'll fight back. And you're not just changing the will, you're changing everything. Ellie nodded, her expression unreadable. I've thought it through. This isn't about the money. It's about respect. And Madison, she's never understood that. I won't let her make a mockery of what I've worked for. Lily will carry the legacy. She's the only one who understands the meaning of loyalty. Robert nodded, a look of approval flashing in his eyes, but there was something else there. Concern, maybe even caution. I'll take care of the numbers, Ellie. I'll make sure the trust is set up properly and that everything is buttoned up. No loose ends. Good, Ellie said, standing up. And don't forget, I need her out. I want everything moved under Lily's name, immediately. No delays. As Ellie left Robert's office, she felt a sense of finality settling into her chest. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed again. Another text from Madison. Why won't you respond? We need to talk. This is important. Ellie stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen. She could feel the weight of Madison's manipulations trying to slip through the cracks of her resolve, but Ellie wasn't swayed. She was done. No response. The decision had been made, and she wouldn't apologize for it. Madison would soon learn that there were consequences to treating Ellie like a mere bystander in her own life. The morning light was already starting to fade when Ellie sat at her desk, the papers before her almost as familiar as the back of her hand. The sound of the rustling documents filled the room, the crinkle of old paper underscoring the weight of what she was about to do. She had spent decades building this empire, every detail, every decision, every contract carefully etched into the framework of her life. And now, as she flipped through the stack of legal documents, Ellie felt a strange satisfaction in the quiet finality of it all. Her fingers brushed against the topmost page, the original deed to the property. It was yellowed with age, but still legible, the ink sharp and clear. Ellie's name was the only one on it. Her name, the name of the woman who had built this place from the ground up, who had weathered every storm and come out stronger on the other side. There was no one else to claim it, no other signature to dispute her ownership. It had always been hers. The weight of the paper seemed heavier today, though. The history it carried was no longer just a testament to hard work. It was now a weapon, an anchor in her fight, a reminder of her place in this world, in this family. She wasn't a tenant. She wasn't renting time. She was the owner, and she would never let anyone forget it. Ellie turned the page, her eyes scanning the trust documents she'd signed with James just days ago. She'd read them a dozen times, each clause reinforcing the choice she had made. Lily would inherit everything. There would be no more room for Madison's entitlement. No more room for her disrespect. Ellie's gaze lingered on the section that described the terms of the trust, her mind flickering with the thought of how it would all play out. The irrevocable decisions were now sealed. Madison was no longer part of it. The mortgage paperwork followed, another layer of proof that the property was Ellie's and Ellie's alone. She reviewed each number, each date, each fine print. It all led back to her. She smiled softly, a quiet satisfaction curling at the edges of her lips. She had built this. Every stone in the foundation, every inch of the sprawling home was hers. There was no one else to thank but herself. Ellie glanced down at the power of attorney document, its importance not lost on her. This piece of paper gave her control over every decision, every financial choice, every move made from here on out. Madison's name had never been on it. It had always been Ellie's. She had set the terms of her life. And now, she would be the one to set the terms of its ending. Her fingers hovered over the signature lines, but she didn't need to sign anything today. She had already signed her life away to these documents, binding herself in a contract with a future she had long known was inevitable. Madison had just been the catalyst. Ellie had been preparing for this moment for years. Just as Ellie leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of her thoughts settle around her, her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced down at the screen. A text from Kyle, her son. "Are you okay? You're not staying in the garage, right?" A soft chuckle escaped her lips at the lightheartedness of the message. Kyle had always been protective, always looking out for her. But Ellie couldn't help but wonder if he was beginning to see the depth of what she had done. Was he starting to understand? She typed a quick response, her fingers moving across the keys with a steady precision. "Not yet, darling, but it's coming." She sent the message with a small, almost wistful smile. Kyle didn't know the half of it, didn't know what Ellie was truly capable of when pushed too far. But he would, soon enough. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from Kyle. It was a message from Phil, her longtime confidant and business associate. "You're moving ahead with this, aren't you? It's time." Ellie stared at the message for a moment, the words like a quiet affirmation of everything she had decided. It's time. She'd been waiting for the right moment, letting the decision sit and marinate in her mind, weighing the consequences. But now, with everything signed, everything in place, there was no more waiting. "The time has come," she replied, her fingers sending the words out into the world like a declaration. The final step had been taken, and there was no turning back. Ellie set the phone down, her eyes flickering back to the documents. Her legacy, her future, all rested in these pages. She had protected it from every corner, from every threat. And now, she would be the one to dictate who was allowed to share in it. As the last light of the day dimmed outside her window, Ellie sat back, her thoughts heavy with the quiet certainty of what she had done. Madison's world was about to crumble, and Ellie had made sure of it. The air inside Ellie's study felt thick, the weight of impending action hanging over her like a storm cloud. She sat at her desk, the hum of her computer filling the silence. The screen in front of her glowed with the stark words of the eviction notice she was about to send. She had already prepared the legal documents, the papers that would sever the last remaining ties to the people who had once called this place home. The ones who had, without hesitation, crossed every line Ellie had drawn. Her fingers hovered over the keys, the cursor blinking back at her like a silent challenge. She could hear Madison's voice echoing in her mind, that venomous remark about renting time. How easily she had dismissed Ellie, as if the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the nights spent building this life from scratch, meant nothing. Ellie had spent a lifetime proving herself, but Madison had never been one to understand that. It's time, Ellie thought again, her resolve solidifying in the quiet of the room. She began to type, the words flowing with precision, the tone cold, legal. She had made the decision, and there would be no turning back. Subject: immediate termination of access to property. 2. Daniel and Megan Carrington. Effective immediately, as of date, all access rights to the Carrington residence located at address are hereby terminated. This action is pursuant to the final decision of the property owner, Eleanor Carrington, and is in accordance with the established legal rights outlined in the original and updated will, as well as the power of attorney granted to me by my late husband and myself. Please be advised that all keys, access codes, and security privileges have been revoked. The locks on all entrances will be changed promptly, and you are required to vacate the premises immediately. Any further attempts to access the property or remove items will be considered trespassing. This decision is final. Sincerely, Eleanor Carrington. Ellie leaned back in her chair, the finality of her actions settling deep within her chest. She reread the email twice before hitting send. There was no turning back now. Daniel and Megan would understand exactly what this meant. They had no claim, no right to be here anymore. This house, this life, it was hers alone. The final blow had been struck. She picked up the phone, dialing Phil's number. The line rang once, twice, and then clicked over to his voice. "Phil," she said, her voice steady, cool, as always. "The notice has been sent. Everything is set. I want to make sure everything is locked down legally. No room for error." Phil's voice was calm but with an undertone of approval. "I'll confirm with the legal team, Ellie. Everything's bulletproof. Daniel and Megan won't be able to fight it. But you know it's going to get messy. They won't give up without a fight." Ellie didn't hesitate. "I'm ready for that." She hung up, her eyes moving toward the large window across from her desk. The darkening sky mirrored the calm, controlled storm inside her. She was in charge now. She had always been in charge. But now, there would be no mistaking it. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen. It was Daniel. His name flashed across the screen, followed by a single message. "What is this?" Her fingers lingered on the keys, but she didn't respond immediately. She could feel the old anger rising in her chest, the familiar bitterness that came with being underestimated. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her immediate reaction. No, this time, Ellie would wait. Instead, she let out a slow, measured breath, composed as always. She moved to the next task. There was a deep sense of satisfaction in the routine, in doing things the way they needed to be done. Then, her phone rang. It was Megan. "Ellie." Megan's voice came through, strained with something close to panic. "You can't do this. This is our house." Ellie felt a quiet smile tug at the corner of her lips. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words, but this time, they held no weight. The house was hers. Always had been. "You're right," Ellie said, her voice calm, almost disinterested. "It's mine." She could hear Megan sputtering, her words rising in desperation. But Ellie ended the call before she could say anything else. There was no more need to argue, no more need to explain. The decision had been made, the lines drawn. Ellie sat back, letting the silence settle over her once again. The house, the wealth, the legacy. It was all in her hands now. And as much as Daniel and Megan might try to reclaim what they thought they were entitled to, it wasn't theirs anymore. The phone buzzed again, but Ellie didn't even glance at it this time. The game had changed. She had already won. She had made sure of it. The heavy oak doors of Ellie's study closed with a soft click, the room enveloped in the familiar silence. She sat behind her desk, the papers before her now a mere formality. Ellie had already taken the hard steps. The decisions had been made. The action had been taken. But there was still more to solidify, more to prepare. She called Phil, as she had every time something this critical was at stake. He was more than a business associate. He was a man she trusted, someone who had helped her shape the empire she had built. They had worked together for years, through thick and thin, and Ellie knew he could help her now, just as he always had. Phil arrived a little after noon, his presence almost as immediate as his arrival. He walked in, his sharp gray suit a perfect reflection of his methodical demeanor. He was, in many ways, Ellie's rock, a steady hand who understood the finer intricacies of real estate and, more importantly, the psychology behind it all. His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. "Ellie," he said as he took a seat opposite her. His voice, calm and controlled, matched the man who had never been flustered, no matter how high the stakes had gotten. "Phil," she responded, offering him a slight smile. "We need to go over everything, every inch of it. The portfolio, the property, the history. I want to be sure that when this goes public, there's no chance of them coming back. We can't afford to leave any gaps." Phil nodded, already unrolling a set of detailed property maps and documents. "I've got everything here, all the properties you've acquired over the years. The entire portfolio is secure. It's all legally locked down, protected." Ellie leaned forward, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of one of the maps. She wasn't just the owner of the Carrington home. She was the owner of dozens of prime properties around the city. Valuable, strategic investments. It was her blueprint, her legacy, and it was all perfectly executed. Every inch of land she controlled, every building, every square foot of real estate was hers, legally and irrefutably. Her thoughts turned to Madison, then to Daniel and Megan, those who had never truly understood the extent of what she had created. To them, it had always been about entitlement, their right to the wealth and power she had built. But now Ellie had ensured that everything would pass to those who truly understood the value of it. Lily. "We'll need to make sure the public perception remains intact," Phil continued, his voice cutting through her reverie. "There are always vultures circling, critics, media, opportunists. They'll try to pick apart your decisions, but they won't get a foothold." Ellie's lips pressed into a tight smile, her eyes cold but resolute. "Let them come. It won't matter. I've spent a lifetime protecting this family's reputation, and I'll spend the next one ensuring that no one tries to rewrite the story." Phil made a note, but Ellie could see the slight glint of approval in his eyes. He respected her, as always. But now there was something more, a sense of completion. They were both on the same page. She was done playing by the rules set by others. It was her game now. "I'll draft a strategy for a complete takeover of any lingering assets, anything tied to them," Phil said, tapping his pen against his notebook. "You'll need to be prepared for their retaliation. It's not going to be smooth." "I'm prepared," Ellie replied, her voice low but unwavering. She met his gaze, the message clear. She was ready to handle whatever came next. As they spoke, Ellie's mind began to sharpen. She thought about the house, the security systems, the legal barriers she had put in place. Daniel and Megan could try all they wanted to claw their way back into what they thought was rightfully theirs, but they would find only resistance. They had no claim anymore. It had been eradicated. Later that day, Ellie received word that Daniel and Megan had begun trying to move some of their belongings out of the house. It was no surprise. She had expected this act of defiance. But the sight of them in her house, rifling through drawers and cabinets as if they still had the right to do so, twisted something deep inside her. She didn't confront them immediately. No, that wasn't necessary. Instead, Ellie made her way downstairs to her private office, where she could monitor everything via the security cameras. Through the screens, she watched as Daniel stormed through the living room, anger flashing across his face as he muttered to himself. Megan stood near the staircase, glancing nervously at the door. They were trying to act as if they still had a place here, but they didn't. Ellie's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Kyle. He'd been quieter these past few days, but Ellie knew her son well enough to know when something was off. "Why is Mom getting so upset?" the text read. Ellie paused before responding, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Kyle was starting to sense the shifts in the air. He was perceptive like that. He had always been the more sensitive one of the family, and she could see that his curiosity had been piqued by the change in atmosphere. "She's not upset? Darling, just preparing for the future." She hit send, her smile faint but knowing. Kyle would understand eventually. When the dust settled, he would realize why it had to be this way. He would see why she had to sever these ties completely. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She stood, smoothing the front of her blouse. Her eyes flicked to the security screen once more. Megan was leaving, her shoulders hunched in defeat. It wasn't over yet. But for the first time in years, Ellie could feel the freedom in her hands. She had controlled the background, the history, the legalities. Now, the world would watch as the final act unfolded. And as for Daniel and Megan, they were already on their way out. The game was hers to win. And no one, not even her own blood, could change that. The evening was settling in with an eerie calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Ellie sat at her desk, her fingers idly tapping the edge of her phone. She had already made her peace with the decision she'd taken. The house was hers, Madison's claims were irrelevant, and soon enough, Daniel and Megan would be fully out of the picture. The game was hers to control now. She had done what was necessary, and her victory felt sweeter with every passing hour. Just as the clock ticked past 7 p.m., her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Kyle checking in or Phil offering updates. No, this time it was an email. Ellie's gaze sharpened as she read the subject line, "Formal notice regarding inheritance." Her fingers stilled on the screen. She hadn't expected this to come so quickly, if at all. But Madison was nothing if not persistent. The email was short but sharp, each word dripping with legalese and the arrogance Ellie had come to expect from her daughter. Subject: Demand for restoration of inheritance from Madison Carrington to Eleanor Carrington. Dear Eleanor, I am writing to formally demand that the recent amendments to the will be reversed immediately. Your decision to alter the inheritance, effectively cutting me out of the will and transferring all assets to Lily, is in violation of my rights as your daughter. This change was made under undue influence, and I have reason to believe you were not mentally competent when making this decision. The suddenness of this action, and the lack of any prior consultation, raises serious concerns about your ability to make sound decisions. I am requesting that you restore my inheritance to its original terms, effective immediately. If you fail to comply, I will have no choice but to pursue legal action. I expect your prompt response to this matter. Sincerely, Madison Carrington. Ellie stared at the screen, her fingers gripping the edge of her phone until the plastic creaked under the pressure. Undue influence. Mental incompetence. The words burned, and the audacity of them, the implication that she was somehow incapable of making her own decisions. It was enough to make her blood boil. But Ellie had seen this coming. Madison would try anything to regain control, to wrestle back what she believed was her inheritance. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of Ellie's lips. She had expected nothing less from her daughter. It was predictable. And in a way, it only confirmed how right her decision had been. Without a moment's hesitation, Ellie tapped out a response, her fingers moving quickly, decisively. She wasn't going to engage with Madison's claims herself. There was no need. The legal battle was already won, and Ellie had the best ally in the business to ensure it stayed that way. She forwarded the email to James, her trusted lawyer and longtime friend, the man who had always been by her side during every significant crossroads of her life. Subject: FD Thou. Demand for restoration of inheritance. From Eleanor Carrington to James Cole. James, I need you to handle this. Madison's lawyer has sent a formal demand to restore her inheritance, claiming undue influence and mental incompetence. It's absurd, of course, but I want to be sure there's no possibility of her gaining any ground. Please prepare a response. Make it clear that the will was updated with full legal guidance and intent, and there's no basis for her claims. This ends here. Ellie set her phone down, her mind already moving past the email. The thought of Madison trying to tear down the legacy Ellie had built was almost laughable. But it wouldn't be funny for long if this dragged out. She needed to nip this in the bud, and James would handle it. He was methodical, careful. He'd see it through to the end, just like always. As the minutes passed, Ellie found herself on edge, even though she knew the outcome was inevitable. Madison had no case. She was on the outside now, and no amount of legal threats could change that. Her phone buzzed again, and Ellie's pulse quickened as she saw the new message was from James. Subject: Re. FWD. Demand for restoration of inheritance. From James Cole to Eleanor Carrington. Ellie, I've reviewed Madison's claim. It's baseless. There's no legal standing for her to challenge the will. The amendments were made with full legal guidance and intent, and any attempt to claim undue influence is without merit. I will prepare a formal response to her lawyer, outlining the specifics. It will be clear that this is not negotiable. Rest assured, this will be resolved quickly. Ellie read the email twice, feeling a surge of relief. James was exactly what she needed in moments like this: calm, assured, and unwavering. The legalities were bulletproof. Madison had no recourse. The game was over. But as Ellie leaned back in her chair, something in the back of her mind nagged at her. It wasn't the threat of a legal battle. It was the realization that this was only the beginning of the fallout. Madison wouldn't go quietly, and while Ellie had already won the first round, the emotional aftermath would ripple through the family, changing everything in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Still, Ellie was resolute. She'd fought for this. She'd earned it. And she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all her own daughter, tear it down now. The decision had been made, and it was done. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet murmur of spectators, lawyers, and court staff. The kind of hum that filled the space before something significant happened. Madison sat at one side of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of indignation. Ellie, on the other side of the courtroom, sat alone, calm, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her glass of water. The contrast between them was striking, and in that moment, Ellie knew she held all the power. Madison had insisted on a public hearing. She wanted to make her case known, to turn the tables in front of the family, to paint Ellie as irrational, unstable, someone who had been manipulated into making such an extreme decision. She had underestimated Ellie, though, because Ellie wasn't going to play the game Madison thought she would. Theatrics were not her style. Ellie let the courtroom's noise fade into the background as she focused on the one thing that mattered: maintaining control. She wasn't going to rise to the bait, wasn't going to let Madison pull her into a public spectacle. That was what Madison wanted. But Ellie had already won. Her legal team, led by James, had prepared for this. They had a strategy, a response, and a wealth of evidence that would completely dismantle Madison's claims. The legal brief was ironclad. The more Madison pushed, the more she would expose her own flaws. James had been methodical, ruthless as always. The facts were simple. The will had been amended with full legal guidance, and Ellie's decisions had been made without influence or pressure. Madison, however, was determined to fight. As the hearing began, Ellie could feel the eyes of the room on her. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with doubt, but none of them mattered. What mattered was how this would end, and Ellie already knew the answer. She had made her decision, and nothing would change it. Madison's voice broke through the silence, loud and defiant. "This is a travesty," she said, her words echoing off the walls of the courtroom. "My mother is being manipulated. This entire will change is a sham. I'm the rightful heir to everything, not Lily." Ellie remained still, unfazed. Her fingers continued to trace the rim of her glass, her gaze focused on the way the light caught the surface of the water. Her silence was more powerful than any words she could say. Let Madison rage. Let her paint herself as the victim. It would only make her fall further. James rose to speak, his voice smooth, controlled, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, we've heard the accusations. But let us be clear. Madison Carrington's claim of undue influence is entirely without merit. The decision to amend the will was not made under duress, nor was it a result of any external manipulation." James laid the evidence out with careful precision. The legal documents were meticulous, the amendments clear, the guidance from Ellie's attorneys undeniable. With each word, Madison's credibility began to fray. Her history of manipulation, of disregarding Ellie's wishes when they didn't fit her narrative, was on full display, neatly outlined by James's careful cross-examination. Madison's face reddened with every word James spoke. Her defense was a haphazard mess of accusations, each more desperate than the last. She tried to paint Ellie as a woman who was confused, mentally compromised, but it was already clear to the judge, and to everyone else, that the only thing compromised was Madison's own integrity. As James moved through the evidence, showing Madison's repeated disregard for Ellie's decisions over the years, Ellie watched from the sidelines, her presence unshaken. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, but she did not flinch. She knew how this would play out. And then, it happened. The judge, a middle-aged man with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, turned to Madison and asked the question that sealed her fate. "Madison Carrington, if your mother's wishes are so clearly influenced and irrational, why have you refused to respect them in the past? Why are you now choosing to fight this, when you know the family's history of loyalty?" Madison's words faltered. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling as if she were grasping for an answer that simply wasn't there. I, it's just... Her voice trailed off, her confidence cracking under the weight of the question. She stumbled over her words, her anger and frustration making her seem less like a woman who had been wronged and more like someone who knew her arguments were hollow. Ellie didn't need to say anything. The truth was now painfully obvious to everyone in the room. Madison had been playing a game of power, and she had lost. James turned back to the judge, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. "Your Honor, as we've demonstrated, there is no legal basis for Madison Carrington's claim. The will was updated with full legal counsel and with the complete consent of the rightful owner, Eleanor Carrington. Ellie watched as Madison's face twisted with disbelief, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before her. In that moment, Ellie knew it was over. Madison had tried to take everything from her, her family, her legacy, but in the end, Ellie had shown that the foundation of everything she had built was solid, unwavering. The judge nodded, glancing between the two women before giving his final ruling. Ellie's grip on her water glass tightened, but her face remained neutral. She didn't need the judge's verdict to know what was coming. It was already done. As the court session was adjourned, Ellie stood, quietly collected her things. She could feel Madison's eyes on her as she left the courtroom, but Ellie didn't flinch. She had won. The world would see it too. The game was over, and as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, Ellie allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The tension that had been building for weeks was about to reach its breaking point. As Ellie walked into the dimly lit conference room, the quiet whispers of the family were already swirling around her. Her decision had sent shockwaves through the Carrington clan, and now they were gathering to confront her. Ryan's eyes locked onto hers the moment she stepped inside, his face flushed with anger, a combination of disbelief and frustration written all over him. He was the first to speak, his voice sharp, but with a hint of desperation. "Maggie," he began, his hands clenched at his sides. "What is this? Why did you change everything? You can't just cut us out like this. This is insane." Ellie, who had expected his reaction, remained calm, her eyes cool as she met his gaze. She had already given up any hope of reconciling with him. Ryan had always been about the power, the control. He wanted the inheritance. But he had never truly understood the price of it, the price that Ellie had paid to get here. Megan stood beside Ryan, her hands wringing in the silence that followed. There was a hint of fear behind her facade, but more than that, there was an unspoken desperation. She hadn't expected this to happen. The loss was too great, and it wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or the lack of it. The fact that Ellie had made this decision without consulting her was a betrayal in their eyes. "This isn't what you think," Megan finally said, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "It's a misunderstanding, right? We'll fix it. We'll fix everything. You didn't mean for it to be like this." Ellie watched Megan's eyes dart nervously as she tried to maintain control of the situation. It was too late for that. The decisions had been made. The lines had been drawn, and nothing could undo it. Ellie didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang in the air like a thick fog. She could see the shift in the room, the way everyone was waiting for her to explain, to justify. But she wouldn't. Instead, Maggie remained unmoved. Her posture was perfect, regal even, as she turned to face the two of them. "You may have meant it as a joke," Maggie said, her voice cold, almost amused. "But I'm not laughing." The room fell silent. The weight of Maggie's words settled over the Carrington family like a heavy blanket. They had expected Ellie to react, expected her to show some sign of regret or hesitation. But she didn't. Maggie had been underestimated for far too long, and now, finally, she was taking her place at the center of it all. Ryan's face twisted with frustration, but there was something else there now. Fear, uncertainty. He had thought the inheritance was his right, his by birth. But the rules had changed, and they couldn't get the control back. Not anymore. "What are you going to do about this?" Ryan demanded, his tone becoming more shrill. "You're just going to let this happen?" Maggie stood up, her posture straight and unyielding. Her voice was calm, but it carried the full weight of someone who had made her choice and was standing firm. "You'll have your day in court, Ryan. I'm sure the legal answers will come soon enough." She didn't flinch when he shot her a look of disbelief. Maggie knew the game was over for him, and it was just a matter of time before he realized it too. The inheritance wasn't his, not anymore. It belonged to Lily. He wasn't even a part of the picture now. Lucas, who had been standing off to the side, quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. His voice was soft but steady, as he turned to Maggie with a look of admiration that no one else in the room had shown. "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Maggie's eyes softened for a moment, but only just. She hadn't expected Lucas to speak up, but his words held more weight than any of the others had. There had always been a part of her that feared Lucas might side with his parents, might follow the path of entitlement. But his loyalty, his understanding of what Ellie had done, made her heart swell just a little. "I've been underestimated my whole life, kiddo," Maggie replied, a small knowing smile tugging at her lips. She reached out and patted his shoulder, as if confirming the truth of her statement. "But now, finally, I'm the one who gets to decide." There was something powerful in that moment. The calm certainty in Maggie's voice, the quiet resolve that had been building for years. This was no longer about wealth or power. It was about who had the strength to stand firm when everything they had built was being taken from them. Maggie wasn't just standing firm, she was taking back what was hers. Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The reality was sinking in. The house, the legacy, everything that had once been his to claim was slipping through his fingers, and he could do nothing to stop it. Ellie watched from the corner, her gaze steady, unbothered. This wasn't just her victory. This was Maggie's victory too. They had both built something together, something that would survive long after the Carrington name had faded into irrelevance. And as the family stood in stunned silence, Ellie couldn't help but feel a sense of finality settle over her. The game had changed. She had changed it. The Carrington legacy would live on. But it would live on her terms. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that clung to the air like thick fog. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of the final decision. The buzz of the last few weeks, the back and forth, the accusations, the mounting pressure, had all led to this moment. Ellie sat at the table, her posture perfect, her gaze unwavering. She was the picture of calm composure, the very embodiment of the control she had fought so hard to retain. Across from her, Madison looked disheveled, her hair slightly out of place, her hands jittering as she fumbled with the papers in front of her. There was no trace of the confidence she had once shown. The fight had drained her, and it was evident to everyone in the room. She was no longer the forceful figure she had been at the beginning of the proceedings. Now she looked like a woman whose world had unraveled. The judge, a man whose reputation for clear, no-nonsense decisions had preceded him, sat poised at the bench, his eyes scanning the room. The final hearing had begun. Madison's lawyer had made one last desperate attempt to sway the court, presenting his arguments with all the urgency of someone who knew the end was near. But Ellie didn't need to listen to the words anymore. She knew the outcome. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a quiet certainty that had been building ever since the first legal document had been signed. As the lawyer finished his statements, the judge looked over the legal documents once more before speaking, his voice firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've reviewed the facts, the evidence, and the testimony provided. The will has been amended legally, with full and competent counsel. The claims made by Madison Carrington regarding undue influence and mental incompetence have no merit." Ellie's fingers clenched subtly around the edge of the table, but her expression remained neutral. This was it. The moment she had worked for, the final affirmation that everything she had done was not only legal, but justified. The judge continued, his voice authoritative. "The decision to alter the will stands. I hereby reaffirm the validity of the new will, and the request to restore Madison Carrington's inheritance is denied. The room seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat, and then the air in the courtroom thickened with the realization that it was over. The fight had been lost. Madison's jaw tightened as she shot a look of disbelief at the judge. Her hands, which had been trembling earlier, now curled into fists on the table. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words were lost before they could even form. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, her voice raw with frustration. But it was clear that even she knew there was no more room for argument. The ruling was final. Ellie stood, her back straight, her gaze steady as the judge continued. "The decision is final. No further claims will be entertained. Court is adjourned." As the gavel struck, the weight of the decision fell into place. Ellie turned to her lawyer, James, who had been sitting beside her, his calm demeanor never wavering throughout the entire ordeal. She didn't need to say much. Her gaze alone was enough. "That's the end of it," she said quietly, her voice low but resolute. James gave a small nod, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "You've done it, Ellie," he said, the hint of a smile on his face. "It's over." But the victory was bittersweet. Ellie could feel Madison's eyes burning into her from across the room, and though the legal battle had ended, the emotional fallout was only just beginning. There was no doubt in her mind that Madison would never accept defeat. But it didn't matter anymore. Madison had already lost. This had been the final test, and Ellie had passed. As Ellie walked out of the courtroom, the whispers of the family followed her like a trailing echo. Daniel and Megan were still sitting at the back, their expressions unreadable. They had remained quiet through the entire process, but Ellie knew they were seething with anger. They, too, had lost their claim. They would never have what they thought was rightfully theirs. As Ellie stepped into the cool air outside the courthouse, she felt a fleeting sense of relief, though it was quickly replaced by the familiar, cold satisfaction of knowing the battle had been won. Her legacy was intact, and the power to control her fate had never been more firmly in her hands. And as she glanced back one last time at the courthouse doors, the finality of it all settled in. The court had made its ruling, but Ellie knew something deeper had shifted. This was no longer just about money, power, or inheritance. This was about respect, about showing that no one, not even her own flesh and blood, could take what she had built. It was over, and Ellie knew that the real victory, the one that mattered most, was only just beginning. The days following the courtroom ruling were heavy with the weight of finality. The quiet that hung in the Carrington home felt different now, still, but charged with an undercurrent of tension that Ellie could almost taste. She had won. But the cost was more than just the inheritance. It was the family that had once been her world, the ties that had unraveled with every legal document signed. Ryan's assets were the first to fall. Ellie had been swift in freezing his accounts, cutting off his access to the wealth he thought was his birthright. Her lawyer had handled it all, pursuing every necessary legal step to ensure that no part of the family fortune would slip from her grasp, not even a fraction. Ryan, who had always believed his position was secured by his name, was now a man cut off, stranded without the financial means he had so long relied on. Megan, the quiet accomplice, tried to avoid Ellie's calls. She knew what had happened, but she couldn't bring herself to face her mother's triumph. The shame was suffocating, and though she wasn't as vocal in her discontent as Ryan, Ellie could feel her absence in the silence. There were no calls, no messages to mend what had been broken between them. Megan had never understood what Ellie had fought for, and now she would never have the chance. Ellie didn't mind. She was done trying to explain herself to those who could never grasp her intentions. They had seen her as a source of money, a stepping stone to the life they thought they deserved. But now that Ellie had pulled the rug out from under them, they would see her for who she really was. Not just a mother, not just a provider, but a woman who had earned every bit of her success. In the midst of all of this, Lucas had been watching closely. The young boy, once so uncertain, now seemed to grasp the weight of his grandmother's strength. He had always been quiet, more thoughtful than the others, but now Ellie noticed the way he observed her with a newfound respect. It wasn't just the inheritance that mattered to Lucas. It was the courage to take control, to protect what was hers from those who would tear it apart. And Ellie could see, deep down, that Lucas was beginning to understand the price of power. One afternoon, Ellie sat at her desk, reviewing the final set of legal documents. The ruling had been made, but there was one more step. Ryan needed to be informed. The assets had been locked down, his attempts to claim anything more dismissed, but he still had the option to appeal. It was a formality, a last bit of protocol before everything was set in stone. Her fingers moved across the papers, composing a message that would close the door on Ryan once and for all. Subject: Final legal notification from Eleanor Carrington to Ryan Carrington. Ryan, as per the court's final ruling, all claims to the inheritance are dismissed. Your assets have been frozen, and the will has been finalized. Should you choose to appeal, the option remains, but the decision stands firm and irreversible. The trust is now irrevocable. No further action is necessary from your side. Ellie sat back for a moment, her eyes scanning the words. There was no bitterness in the note, no venom. It was final. There was nothing left to fight for. She clicked. Send. Moments later, her phone buzzed. It was a message from James, confirming that all of Ryan's legal avenues had been closed. There was nothing left for him to do but accept the loss. It was over. For Ryan, the power he had assumed was his was now a distant memory. As Ellie stared at the glowing screen of her phone, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The storm had passed. The battle had been won. Not just in court, but in every decision, every silent struggle that had led her here. The empire she had built would remain in her hands, untouched, unchallenged. And for the first time, she realized how little she needed from anyone to maintain it. Later that evening, she sat with Lucas on the porch, the quiet evening breeze ruffling the pages of a book in her hands. He was unusually quiet, his eyes reflecting the distant lights of the city, as if deep in thought. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tentative. "Yes, sweetheart," Ellie replied, turning toward him, her gaze warm but serious. "Why did you do it? Why didn't you just let them have it?" Ellie smiled, a small, knowing smile that only Lucas could see. Because Lucas, they never understood what it took to build something. They thought they could take it without realizing how much was lost along the way. I did it because I had to protect what I created. And sometimes, people don't deserve a second chance when they've already taken everything for granted. Lucas nodded slowly, his young mind absorbing the weight of her words. He was learning, growing, and Ellie knew that one day he would carry the lessons she had taught him. Lessons that would stand him in good stead long after the Carrington name had faded from the public's view. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he whispered again, his words full of quiet respect. Ellie's smile widened, her heart swelling with a fierce pride. "I've always been underestimated, Lucas," she said softly, her voice tinged with a deep, lived wisdom. "But now I'm the one who gets to decide." And as the evening stretched on, Ellie leaned back in her chair, a sense of finality settling over her once again. It was done. She had fought, and she had won. The rest of her family would have to come to terms with it, but Ellie was done explaining herself. The time for that had passed, and now Ellie could finally enjoy the silence that only victory could bring. The weeks that followed the courtroom ruling were suffocating in their stillness, and yet, for Ellie, they were a welcome peace. From the outside, it appeared as though the Carrington family had simply gone their separate ways. Quiet, subdued, like a once boisterous machine now sputtering to a halt. But Ellie knew better. Beneath the surface there was a deep, painful shift, one that neither Ryan nor Megan could escape. Ryan, never one to back down without a fight, tried to rebuild. He started selling off his belongings, his assets, things that had once symbolized his claim to the Carrington legacy. He didn't know where to start, how to regain the position he felt was owed to him, but he knew he had to keep moving. His pride would never let him lie down in defeat, even as the weight of the loss settled in. The house he had once called home now felt like a cage, every corner reminding him of his failed claim. Megan, on the other hand, retreated into the quiet spaces she had always avoided. She didn't speak to Ellie, didn't try to explain herself. Instead, she buried herself in work, in her own attempts to restore some sense of stability. The phone calls to her mother remained unanswered, her absence deafening. But Ellie didn't press. She didn't need to. Megan was never meant to understand the sacrifice, the fight. She had always been content to float along, sheltered by the power and wealth that Ellie had created. Now that shelter was gone, and so was Megan's place in Ellie's world. Ellie, meanwhile, reveled in the quiet that surrounded her. The power struggle was over. Her name, her empire, stood untouched. She didn't need to gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching them struggle. It wasn't about revenge or humiliation. Ellie didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The silence that followed was all the victory she needed. She spent her days in the warmth of her home, looking out the windows at the tree-lined streets that seemed so much quieter now. The world outside continued on. People came and went, living their lives, unaware of the silent victory that Ellie had secured for herself. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel this calm, this certainty that what she had built was unshakable. Lucas, ever the quiet observer, visited often. At first, his visits had been brief, almost hesitant. He had always been a soft presence, not as loud as Ryan or as passive as Megan. But lately, Ellie could sense a shift in him. He was growing up, growing into the man he would one day become. There was no confusion in his eyes anymore, no questioning. He had seen the truth. He understood the weight of what Ellie had done, not just for herself, but for the family. One afternoon, after a long day of paperwork, Ellie found herself on the porch, the fading light casting a golden glow over the yard. Lucas sat beside her, his legs dangling over the edge of the step, his gaze lost in the distance. He hadn't said much, but Ellie knew he was thinking about everything that had happened, the choices she had made, the decisions that had changed the course of their lives. "Grandma," Lucas's voice was soft, like he was testing the waters. "Yes, sweetheart," Ellie replied, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his words heavy with the same question that had been asked by others. But this time, there was no bitterness in it, only curiosity. Ellie smiled, the weight of everything lifting off her shoulders for a brief moment. She looked at Lucas, her grandson, the one who had always seen her for who she truly was. "It wasn't about the money," she said quietly. "It was about who I am. The legacy I built wasn't for anyone to take. It was for me, for us. I couldn't let them take that away, Lucas. Not without understanding the cost." Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes widening with a deep understanding Ellie had never seen before. He was growing up. He was seeing the world through a new lens. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. He didn't need to ask for more explanations. He didn't need to seek out the truth from anyone else. He knew. Ellie smiled, a flicker of pride in her chest. "I've been underestimated my whole life, kiddo," she said, her voice softening. "But now, I'm the one who gets to decide." The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the yard, but Ellie didn't feel the need to move, to hurry. For the first time in a long while, she felt like everything was in its place. The battle had been fought, and the silence that followed was the calm after the storm. There was no anger, no resentment left in her heart. The victory had been hard won, but it was hers, and the legacy she had built would endure. As the evening air grew cooler, Lucas leaned his head on her shoulder, his presence warm and steady. Ellie closed her eyes, a quiet contentment settling over her. Ryan never contacted her again, and neither did Megan. Ellie had expected as much, but she had no regrets. They had chosen their paths, and now they would have to live with the consequences of their choices. The silence between them was final, a confirmation that there was nothing left to say. Ellie's empire was intact. The family was fractured, but Ellie had always known the price of power, and now it was hers to control. The world would keep moving, but the Carrington name, in its truest form, would live on. And for the first time in years, Ellie could finally breathe. Time had moved on since the courtroom victory, and Ellie had settled into her new rhythm. The quiet peace that had once felt strange now felt like a sanctuary. She no longer had to navigate the constant emotional and financial battles that had defined her life for so long. The noise, the demands, the expectations, they had all been silenced. Madison's attempts to reinsert herself into the family fold had faltered miserably. Her calls, her emails, her desperate pleas had all gone unanswered. She had underestimated Ellie's resolve, believing that a few grand gestures or a change of heart would be enough to restore her place in the family. But it wasn't just about the money for Ellie. It was about respect, about protecting what she had spent her life building. Madison had already lost her place, and no amount of effort on her part could change that. She faded from the scene like a shadow that no one bothered to remember. David, ever the passive figure, stood by her side, but even his charm couldn't change the outcome. The once inseparable pair was now nothing more than a whisper of the past, barely mentioned in the family's future plans. Their names had become footnotes in a story Ellie had long since rewritten. Ryan and Megan, on the other hand, seemed to have disappeared from Ellie's world entirely. They no longer asked for favors or support. The calls had stopped coming. The requests for help faded into silence. It was almost as if they had been erased from her life. Ellie didn't resent them. She didn't need to. They had chosen their paths, and now they were living with the consequences of their actions. They would never understand what Ellie had done, but that was their burden to carry, not hers. Ellie watched with quiet satisfaction from the sidelines, her mind always several steps ahead. The business, the empire she had built, was in good hands. Lily, bright, sharp, and with an innate sense of purpose, was starting to take charge. Ellie had seen the spark in her granddaughter from the very beginning, and now, as the next generation began to make its mark, Ellie could see it coming to fruition. The first board meeting Lily led was a quiet revelation. The room had changed. Where once it had been filled with the ghosts of past egos, Ryan's loud assertions, Madison's pointed demands, it was now a space of calm leadership. One where Lily's voice was the center of attention. Ellie had been there to guide her, to teach her. But the future was Lily's now. Ellie was no longer needed in the day-to-day operations. Her legacy was secure, and now she could step back and watch the next generation rise. Ellie sat in the back of the room during that first meeting, a faint smile on her lips as Lily stood at the head of the table. There was no more doubt in her mind that Lily had what it took. She had grown into the leader Ellie had always hoped for. After the meeting, Ellie and Lily had a quiet conversation in Ellie's office. Lily had a habit of coming by after the meetings, needing Ellie's approval, even if she never said it outright. Today, there was something different in Lily's eyes, a confidence Ellie hadn't seen before. You did great today, Ellie said, her voice low but steady. Lily smiled, her gaze flickering with something that resembled pride. I couldn't have done it without everything you've shown me. Ellie smiled back, a quiet sense of pride swelling in her chest. It's all yours now. Lily's eyes sparkled with the realization that the mantle had passed, and she was ready to carry it. For Ellie, there was a moment of peace, knowing that everything she had fought for was now in capable hands. The future of the Carrington legacy wasn't just secure, it was thriving. But not everyone was content to let things rest. Ryan, desperate in his defeat, called Ellie a few weeks later. He'd been trying to make his way back into the fold, just enough to ensure he could rebuild his life, just enough to salvage something of his former status. Ellie? Ryan's voice crackled through the phone, his tone strained but laced with a hint of urgency. I need your help. You know I've always been there for you. Help me out here. I've got nothing left. You can't just leave me in the dust. Ellie listened for a moment, the quiet between them hanging like a chasm. Ryan had always thought that his relationship with her was a transaction, one that could be re-established with a few well-placed words and promises. Ryan, Ellie said, her voice even, there's nothing left for you here. You made your choice. You've lost your place. I won't help you rebuild what you broke. There's nothing to fix. She ended the call without another word, the silence that followed louder than any protest could ever be. As she set the phone down, Ellie took a deep breath. It wasn't about punishment. It was about setting boundaries. Ryan had never understood that. Now he would have to learn. Ellie turned her gaze toward the horizon outside her window, where the city lights flickered softly in the distance. The Empire was secure. Her family, what was left of it, had found their place. Or they hadn't. The rest of the world would move forward, but Ellie knew that the true power had always rested in her hands. The future, once uncertain, was now a canvas, blank and full of possibilities. And Ellie was content to watch it unfold, knowing that this time it would be on her terms. The Carrington legacy was hers. The Carrington name had changed. It no longer carried the weight of family drama, whispered scandal, or entitlement. It carried power, precision, and quiet respect. Ellie had made sure of it. Years had passed since the courtroom battles, the betrayals, the angry phone calls that used to echo through her house. Now, the empire she had fought to build was thriving under new leadership, her legacy fully realized. Lucas sat at the head of the boardroom table now, his presence calm but commanding, the kind of leadership that drew attention without needing to raise its voice. Ellie watched from her seat at the back, a silent observer in the empire she had created. The meeting room gleamed with sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching out below like a testament to her years of sacrifice. Every decision she had made, the alliances, the separations, the painful goodbyes, had led to this moment. Lucas spoke with the kind of confidence that was unmistakably Carrington. His words were measured, his tone assured, but what struck Ellie most was the empathy behind it. He had inherited her strength, yes, but not her bitterness. He was leading not with vengeance, but with vision. It was everything she had hoped for. Across the room, the portraits of past Carringtons lined the wall, faces that had once looked down at her with judgment or indifference. Now they were relics, reminders of a dynasty that had been redefined by her hands. Ellie wasn't just another name in the lineage anymore. She was the lineage, the turning point. Ryan and Megan's influence had long since evaporated. Their names had stopped appearing in conversations. Their calls to former friends went unanswered. They had tried to stay relevant. Small ventures, public gestures, but the world had already moved on. People forgot the ones who coasted. They remembered the ones who built. Ellie had built. The house, her house, was quiet again. Not empty, but peaceful. The walls that had once been filled with argument and resentment now breathed with the calm rhythm of solitude. She'd renovated it, slowly, stripping away every trace of Ryan's touch until the place reflected only her. Each room was deliberate: warm oak, deep blues, and touches of silver that shimmered when the light hit just right. It was a reflection of her, elegant, enduring, untouchable. That evening, as twilight slipped over the horizon, Ellie stood by the large bay window overlooking the gardens. The winter air pressed softly against the glass, the trees outside bare but beautiful in their stillness. It reminded her of herself. Weathered, yes, but alive. She poured herself a glass of red wine, the color rich and deep, and sat in her favorite armchair. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye. The woman who stared back at her wasn't the one who had once fought for recognition in a family that had never valued her. She wasn't the mother constantly placating others or the grandmother trying to hold the pieces together. She was the architect of her own peace. Every decision, every confrontation, every painful separation, each had been a brick in the foundation of this life. There were no regrets. There was no longing for what might have been. The quiet was her reward. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Lucas stepped in, his usual ease about him. "Board approved the expansion," he said with a grin. "We're moving into 3 new cities next quarter. You did it, Grandma. You really built something that lasts." Ellie smiled, setting her glass down. "We did it," she corrected softly. Lucas crossed the room and took a seat beside her, the soft creak of the armchair filling the space between them. "You know," he said after a pause, "people keep talking about the Carrington story like it's history, but to me, it doesn't feel like it's over." Ellie turned to him, her eyes glinting with quiet pride. "That's because it isn't," she said. "You're the next chapter, Lucas. Just don't forget who built the first one." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I won't." As Lucas stood and made his way to the door, Ellie leaned back, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. The warmth wrapped around her like a quiet acknowledgement of all she had endured. For a long moment, she let herself simply be. The empire flourished. The house was hers. The peace was hers. And as the evening deepened, Ellie whispered to herself, not with triumph, but with understanding, "I didn't just survive them. I outlasted them." The clock ticked softly in the background, steady and sure. Outside, the wind carried the faint rustle of winter leaves, a reminder that even when the seasons changed, the roots she had planted would remain. She closed her eyes, a faint smile curving her lips, because Ellie Carrington knew, finally and completely, she had won. The years had settled around Ellie like a second skin, soft where they used to cut, light where they had once weighed heavy. The empire she had built stood taller than ever, its reach stretching far beyond what anyone in her family had imagined possible. The Carrington name, once tethered to scandal and entitlement, had become synonymous with excellence. The morning sun poured through the high windows of the conference room, catching on polished glass and chrome. Ellie sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding even in silence. Across from her, Lily and Lucas led the meeting, 2 steady voices guiding the next generation of Carrington leadership. They had grown into their roles gracefully, and Ellie couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride each time they spoke. Lily's confidence was unmistakable, her gestures measured, her tone authoritative yet fair. She had inherited Ellie's instinct for power, strategic, precise, but had tempered it with empathy. Lucas, beside her, balanced her decisiveness with patience and intuition. Together, they were everything Ellie had hoped for. Proof that legacy, when built on strength and integrity, could endure without corruption. Ellie listened quietly as they discussed expansions, new markets, and charitable ventures. The empire had evolved under their stewardship, modernized but grounded in the foundation she had laid. Every decision, every plan that crossed that table carried traces of her philosophy, discipline, loyalty, purpose. When the meeting adjourned, the room buzzed with the energy of progress. Executives exchanged handshakes and smiles, their admiration for the Carrington successors evident. Ellie remained seated as the others filtered out, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the hall. There, framed by the light spilling through the glass doors, stood a doorway, one that had been part of this building since its inception. It was a symbolic one, in a way. A door that had once been meant for family, her family, to walk through, to join her in building something lasting. But over the years, it had become something else entirely. Ryan had never crossed it again. Madison either. Their faces had faded from memory, erased not by malice, but by irrelevance. In the years since the inheritance battle, neither had returned to the fold. Their attempts to reassert themselves in the world had fizzled into quiet mediocrity. Their names no longer appeared in headlines or society pages, no invitations, no acknowledgments. They had become ghosts orbiting the empire they once believed would always be theirs. And Ellie had made peace with that. She had built something new, without them. A dynasty reborn in her image, untainted by greed or arrogance. Every structure, every contract, every soul that had passed through her doors since was a testament to her will. Her family had fractured, yes, but what rose from the ruins was stronger, sharper, cleaner. She rose from her seat, her reflection gliding along the glossy surface of the table as she made her way toward the window. The city stretched before her, endless and bright. The skyline shimmered with the reflection of the Carrington Tower, her tower, the heart of it all. The door behind her remained closed, as it always had. That was the one she had locked long ago. The one Ryan and Madison had once walked through with entitlement in their voices and expectation in their eyes. She had sealed it not out of spite, but out of necessity. That door represented everything she had left behind: the weakness of appeasement, the ache of unearned loyalty. But every morning Ellie walked through another door, the one that led here, to this room, this world, this life. A door she had built herself. Lily entered quietly, interrupting her thoughts. "You didn't say much today," she said with a smile, carrying a stack of folders under one arm. Ellie turned, her expression serene. "I didn't need to," she replied. "You're doing what I spent my whole life preparing you for." Lily hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever think about them? The ones who aren't here anymore?" Ellie's gaze flickered toward the shut door across the hall. For a moment her face softened, almost reflective. Then the steel returned to her eyes. "No," she said simply. "They made their choice. I made mine." Lily nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind the words. As Lily left, Ellie turned back to the window. Her reflection stared back at her. Not the woman who had been broken by betrayal or driven by revenge, but the one who had transcended both. The matriarch who had built an empire from ashes. Outside, the city hummed with the rhythm of success, the Carrington name emblazoned on every skyline. Inside, Ellie felt the silence of triumph, a silence so complete it bordered on sacred. She walked back toward the table, running her hand along its smooth surface. Every decision had brought her here. Every sacrifice had been worth it. Her eyes drifted one last time toward the door they would never walk through. The lock glinted faintly in the light. She smiled, faint and knowing. At dinner, she murmured to herself, voice low but steady. "My daughter said, 'You're just renting time here.'" She paused, her hand resting on the back of her chair. So I rented her out of the will. The words lingered in the air like the final stroke of a gavel. Quiet, absolute, irrevocable. Outside, the light shifted across the skyline, and the empire she had built shone brighter than ever. The past was sealed behind that door. The future belonged to her.